Nonsense! Nonsense! Any father in my place would have done what I did." Then he went on to say, "Well, you've had your little adventure, and I hope now you've had enough of it. So go upstairs and get your things together while I look out for a hansom." To which the only possible reply seemed to be, "I'm not coming home." "Not coming home?" "No." And, in spite of her resolve to be a person, Ann Veronica began to weep with terror at herself. Apparently she was always doomed to weep when she talked to her father. But he was always forcing her to say and do such unexpectedly conclusive things. She feared he might take her tears as a sign of weakness, so she said, "I won't come home. I'd rather starve." For a moment the conversation hung upon that declaration. Then Mr. Stanley, putting his hands on the table in the manner rather of a barrister than a solicitor, and regarding her balefully through his glasses with quite undisguised animosity, asked, "And may I presume to inquire, then, what you mean to do? How do you propose to live?" "I shall live," sobbed Ann Veronica. "You needn't be anxious about that. I shall contrive to live." "But I am anxious," said Mr. Stanley. "I am anxious. Do you think it's nothing to me to have my daughter running about London looking for odd jobs and disgracing herself?" "Shan't get odd jobs," said Ann Veronica, wiping her eyes. And from that point they went on to a thoroughly embittering wrangle. Mr. Stanley used his authority and commanded Ann Veronica to come home, to which, of course, she said she wouldn't. And then he warned her not to defy him, warned her very solemnly, and then commanded her again. He then said that if she would not obey him in this course, she should never darken his doors again, and was indeed frightfully abusive. This threat terrified Ann Veronica so much that she declared with sobs and vehemence that she would never come home again, and for a time both talked at once and very wildly. He asked her whether she understood what she was saying, and went on to say still more precisely that she should never touch a penny of his money until she came home again, not one penny. Ann Veronica said she didn't care. Then abruptly Mr. Stanley changed his key. "You poor child," he said, "don't you see the infinite folly of these proceedings? Think! Think of the love and affection you abandon. Think of your aunt, a second mother to you. Think if your own mother was alive." He paused, deeply moved. "If my own mother was alive," sobbed Ann Veronica, "she would understand." The talk became more and more inconclusive and exhausting. Ann Veronica found herself incompetent, undignified, and detestable, holding on desperately to a hardening antagonism to her father, quarrelling with him, wrangling with him, thinking of repartees, almost as if he was a brother. It was horrible, but what could she do? She meant to live her own life, and he meant, with contempt and insults, to prevent her. Anything else that was said she now regarded only as an aspect of or diversion from that. In the retrospect she was amazed to think how things had gone to pieces, for at the outset she had been quite prepared to go home again upon terms. While waiting for his coming she had stated her present and future relations with him with what had seemed to her the most satisfactory lucidity and completeness. She had looked forward to an explanation. Instead had come this storm, this shouting, this weeping, this confusion of threats and irrelevant appeals. It was not only that her father had said all sorts of inconsistent and unreasonable things, but that by some incomprehensible infection she herself had replied in the same vein. He had assumed that her leaving home was the point at issue, that everything turned on that, and that the sole alternative was obedience, and she had fallen in with that assumption until rebellion seemed a sacred principle. Moreover, atrociously and inexorably, he allowed it to appear ever and again in horrible gleams that he suspected there was some man in the case. Some man! And to conclude it all was the figure of her father in the doorway, giving her a last chance, his hat in one hand, his umbrella in the other, shaken at her to emphasize his point. "You understand, then," he was saying. "You understand." "I understand," said Ann Veronica, tear-wet and flushed with a reciprocal passion, but standing up to him with an equality that amazed even herself. "I understand." She controlled a sob. "Not a penny. Not one penny. And never darken your doors again." Part 4. The next day her aunt came again and expostulated, and was just saying it was an unheard of thing for a girl to leave her home as Ann Veronica had done, when her father arrived and was shown in by the pleasant-faced landlady. Her father had determined on a new line. He put down his hat and umbrella, rested his hands on his hips, and regarded Ann Veronica firmly. "Now," he said quietly, "it's time we stopped this nonsense." Ann Veronica was about to reply when he went on, with a still more deadly quiet. "I am not here to bandy words with you. Let us have no more of this humbug. You are to come home." "I thought I explained." "I don't think you can have heard me," said her father. "I have told you to come home." "I thought I explained—" "Come home!" Ann Veronica shrugged her shoulders. "Very well," said her father. "I think this ends the business," he said, turning to his sister. "It's not for us to supplicate any more. She must learn wisdom, as God pleases." "But, my dear Peter," said Miss Stanley. "No," said her brother conclusively. "It's not for a parent to go on persuading a child." Miss Stanley rose and regarded Ann Veronica fixedly. The girl stood with her hands behind her back, sulky, resolute, and intelligent, a strand of her black hair over one eye, and looking more than usually delicate-featured, and more than ever like an obdurate child. "She doesn't know." "She does." "I can't imagine what makes you fly out against everything like this," said Miss Stanley to her niece. "What is the good of talking?" said her brother. "She must go her own way. A man's children nowadays are not his own. That's the fact of the matter. Their minds are turned against him. Rubbishy novels and pernicious rascals. We can't even protect them from themselves." An immense gulf seemed to open between father and daughter as he said these words. "I don't see," gasped Ann Veronica, "why parents and children shouldn't be friends." "Friends!" said her father. "When we see you going through disobedience to the devil. Come, Molly, she must go her own way. I've tried to use my authority, and she defies me. What more is there to be said? She defies me." It was extraordinary. Ann Veronica felt suddenly an effect of tremendous pathos. She would have given anything to have been able to frame and make some appeal, some utterance that should bridge this bottomless chasm that had opened between her and her father, and she could find nothing whatever to say that was in the least sincere and appealing. "Father," she cried, "I have to live." He misunderstood her. "That," he said, grimly, with his hand on the door-handle, "must be your own affair, unless you choose to live at Morningside Park." Miss Stanley turned to her. "Vee," she said, "come home, before it is too late." "Come, Molly," said Mr. Stanley at the door. "Vee," said Miss Stanley, "you hear what your father says." Miss Stanley struggled with emotion. She made a curious movement toward her niece. Then suddenly, convulsively, she dabbed down something lumpy on the table and turned to follow her brother. Ann Veronica stared for a moment in amazement at this dark green object that clashed as it was put down. It was a purse. She made a step forward. "Aunt," she said, "I can't—" Then she caught a wild appeal in her aunt's blue eye, halted, and the door clicked upon them. There was a pause, and then the front door slammed. Ann Veronica realized that she was alone with the world, and this time the departure had a tremendous effect of finality. She had to resist an impulse of sheer terror, to run out after them and give in. "Gods!" she said at last, "I've done it this time." "Well!" She took up the neat morocco purse, opened it and examined the contents.